Hello, my name's Chris Nelson. I'm the Diocesan Registrar. This video is for Synod for first timers. Many people are familiar with Synod, but there are some people who are first timers to Synod. So this video is meant to be helpful to those people. First thing to understand about Synod is it's a formal meeting. There are rules about who can speak, when they can speak, and how long they can speak for. There are standing orders for Synod. That is the rule book that all Synod people have that give the major rules about how Synod is to operate. You'll find some in your Synod pack. Please take time to read through the standing orders. The Synod has a president. The bishop is the president of Synod. At our time at the moment, we don't have a bishop, so the administrator, the Archdeacon Gail Hagan, will be the president of the Synod. Now, the president is assisted by the chair of committees. The chair of committees is the person who takes the chair when the Synod decides it wants to go into committee. The administrator or bishop then takes a break. The committee process still involves the whole Synod, but it gives some relaxing of the process of speaking and recording a discussion. It's most typically used when amending detail of an ordinance. Speaking at Synod is granted for a purpose, and as such being invited to report, speaking to a bill or motion, moving a motion, or asking a question. So it's made certain that you understand the standing orders before wanting to speak at Synod. Because it's a formal meeting, visitors to the meeting have to be acknowledged. So please make sure that if you're visiting the meeting, that you sign in as a visitor. All Synod members need to sign the roll. Now let's go through the major elements of a Synod meeting. Synod always starts with worship. In the 2018 Synod, we're starting with worship as a Eucharist at 8:30 on Saturday morning. Please don't consider this to be an optional extra for the Synod. Worship is an important part of the Synod. Even if no motions or resolutions are made during that time, it is still important to our conduct as a church in considering the business of the church. The Synod Eucharist will also include the presidential address, so Archdeacon Gail Hagan will give that presidential address at worship. Other elements of the Synod are reports and presentations, and the approval of financial statements and the budget. Other parts of the Synod are elections. Every 3 years we have a major Synod where elections of all positions are held. But at each Synod there's normally at least 1 or 2 elections that have been held. The corporate trustees elections come up every year, and occasionally there are vacancies in positions that needed to be elected by the Synod. In the 2018 Synod, we have both of these occurring. Ordinances are the major pieces of legislation for the church, and in some dioceses they're called canons. In some dioceses they're laws, but they're the major pieces of legislation which set the hard and fast rules by which the diocese will work. We have motions, which are people move to for a resolution on a particular matter. We have questions which can be asked and petitions, and we'll go into that in more depth shortly. Firstly, elections. In the election process, people to be elected have to be nominated in writing. A proposer and a seconder is required, and the agreement of the nominee is required, of course. Now, the proposer, seconder and nominee all have to be qualified according to that election. So if it's a position that requires a person who must be a member of Synod, then the proposer, seconder and nominee all have to be members of Synod. An election is only held if there's more people nominated than positions are to be filled. So when there's a case of 2 positions to be filled, there's 3 nominees or more, then an election will be held. If there was 1 or 2 nominees, it will not proceed to election. If an election is held, ballot papers are handed out by the Synod secretaries, and you vote by placing a cross beside the name of the person you are voting for. If too many boxes are marked, then the vote will not count. It will be regarded as informal. Ideally, you will mark the exact number of boxes that are required to be marked for that election, but if you accidentally mark less boxes, then your vote will still count to the extent of what you've marked. The completed ballots go into a locked box and are held there until the people counting the votes, the scrutineers, open up the box and work through the counting in a systematic way. Bills. A bill is a document that will become an ordinance of the diocese. So how are they handled? The handling of bills for ordinances is one of the most formal processes within the Synod, and it's handled in stages. Firstly, the President asks the mover and seconder to speak to the general principles of the bill. So in speaking to the general principles of the bill, they talk about why they believe that the bill should be passed. Then the President allows questions about the general principles, not debates or amendments about specific points at this stage, but questions about the general principles, why this bill has been put forward and how is it meant to work. Then the President opens it up for debate on the general principles. So here is the members of Synod's chance to speak for or against the actual general principle of the bill for the ordinance, about why it's a good thing or not so good thing. It's important at this stage that in saying that when you get up to speak about something in terms of a bill or a motion, you need to be speaking either for or against. You can't speak on an associated topic or give a speech that's both for and against. It's got to be either for or against. People need to know what side that you're putting your vote for. So, further to the stage, then there's a vote put by the President to approve the bill in general principle. If that vote is defeated, then the bill goes no further. That is where it finishes and an ordinance is not created. If it is successful, then the bill continues on in the process. The next process is that the President asks whether that debate is to happen in committee. What the President is actually asking there is there any aspect about the detail of the way in which the bill's been written that people want to debate, to make an amendment, that they might agree with the general principle or recognise the general principle has been passed, but they want to have part of it expressed in a different way or written up in a different way, to make amendments. That's handled in committee, and the chair of committees takes over. That has more flexibility than the President to accept comments and to make changes. Once that committee process is finished, it's handed back to the President, and the President organises a vote on the bill, whether it passes with or without amendment. So ultimately, if that process goes through and there's a voting agreement to pass, then you've got a completed bill, and the final stage is the stage of assent. The Synod has the process up to that point. Finally, it's the bishop, or in this case the administrator for this year, who finally needs to assent to the bill. If it doesn't get the bishop's assent, then it doesn't become law. If it it does, then it will, and the bishop has 28 days in which to make that decision. Motions are also entered formally, but they're not quite as complex as bills. Now, you'll find in your synod papers when you receive them, there'll be motions that notice has already been given of. But there'll be various times during the synod when there'll be an invitation for motions, and people will come forward and talk about the motion, actually just read the motion that they propose, and then it's up to the synod to give leave for that motion to be considered. In most situations, the synod does give leave, but may reserve their right to decline it if it's not really relevant business for the synod, or the synod's business is becoming too full, or that matter has been considered in another way, in another context. Now, all motions must have a mover and a seconder. Motions need to be provided in writing and signed and given to the secretaries. A motion that is moved from the floor and accepted by the synod doesn't get dealt with immediately. It then goes to be onto the papers for consideration later in the synod. Within our synods, we have this process occasionally called call-over of motions. It happens early in each day normally, but it can happen more frequently. And the process in a call-over is the president brings the synod's attention to a motion and essentially asks for any objections to that motion being dealt with at that point formally and without further debate. So people who want debate on the motion and believe that the motion should be considered by hearing speeches about the motion and explanation need to call out object. On hearing the word object, that motion is put aside for being dealt with by hearing the mover and seconder and speeches for and against later on the synod. If there's no object, then the president will proceed to move the motion there and then without debate, and there'll be a vote for or against the motion at that point in time in the synod. So the call-over can be used to speed up the synod, where the synod doesn't need to hear any debate about a particular motion, that they feel confident to take the motion just on the writing of the motion. Anyone in the synod can say object, so the motion is debated, except for two people, and that's the mover of the motion and the seconder of the motion. It has to be somebody else apart from the mover and the seconder. So when the motion is actually being debated and spoken to, the motion commences with the mover speaking. The mover gets 8 minutes maximum, and there's a timekeeper to determine that 8 minutes is not being exceeded. The timekeeper will ring the bell with 1 minute to go, therefore giving the speaker warning that the speaker is getting closer to the end of their allotted time. If the speaker reaches the end of the allotted time, the speaker can sometimes ask for the leave of synod for an extension of time. This may be put by the president to the synod, and the synod may agree to extend time or not to. It largely depends on whether the synod feels that more needs to be said or heard about the motion, and whether there's the time to do so. After the mover speaks, the seconder may then speak. The seconder gets 5 minutes maximum. And then it's opened up for members of synod to speak for or against the motion. And as I said before, there needs to be spoken for or against the motion, not just generally speaking about the issue or some side issue. Speakers for or against get 5 minutes minutes maximum. Finally, when everyone's been heard from, there is an opportunity for the mover of the motion to speak again at the end. And at that time, the mover gets 5 minutes to speak. Then the motion's put to the vote and is either accepted or rejected. During that process, there is an opportunity that if people feel that the motion needs to be expressed in a different way, for the motion to be amended. If a person then, instead of speaking for or against the motion, then speaks to propose an amendment to the motion. Before doing so, they should have their amendment written out and signed, so they can hand that amendment to the secretaries of Synod. The amendment to the motion is to change the way the motion is expressed. It's not to reverse or completely change the meaning of the motion, but to change the way it's expressed. If an amendment's been put forward, then the amendment gets dealt with before any further dealing with the main motion. So there are speaking for and against amendments and dealing with the amendment to see if the amendment becomes a motion or gets rejected before proceeding on with the main motion. And ultimately, we have an amended motion. The President controls the debate and can bring the debate to an end if, in her opinion, it's a sufficient airing. However, members of the Synod can move a motion that the question be now put. If that motion gets a seconder, there'll be a vote on the motion that the question be now put without debate. Less common is moving without notice that the Synod proceed to the next item of business. If that's accepted, it essentially avoids or postpones the decision. These are 2 points that you should really look up in your standing orders for Synod if you want to know more about it. But that the question be now put is a useful way of bringing to an end debate that has become long-winded and that people are repeating the same issues or adding to it in a way that is not really useful for the whole Synod. Just a few further points about speaking. Speakers indicate they wish to speak by moving to a microphone in the Synod. There'll be a microphone near the front stage of the Synod where most of the motions are presented from, but there'll also be a chance for a microphone down in the body of the Synod. The Speaker waits on the President or Chair to invite them to speak. The Speaker then addresses the President and Chair to speak to the Synod, and it's polite to introduce yourself by name and parish or organisation. So I would say, Madam President, Chris Nelson, Parish of South Grafton, I rise to speak in favour of the motion. Or there are some alternative ways of doing that. So when the motion gets voted on, mostly it's by the voices. The President or Chair calls for those in favour to say aye, and then for those against to say no. Where the result of the voices is unclear, the President or the Chair may ask for a show of hands. Most of the motions are dealt with in those ways. But a division can be used if there's at least 10 members requesting and they believe that there needs to be a more definitive way of coming to a decision on whether this motion is passed or not. And in a division, people move to one side of the room or another, depending on whether they're voting for or against. And there are people allotted to count the number of people on either side. Sometimes for really contentious issues where it needs to be sure that the vote is supported not only by the majority of Synod members, but also by the majority of lay members and the majority of clergy members. The vote can be, by house, can be used on the request of at least 5 members. Motions need a majority in each house to be successful. Similar to bills, all motions require the assent of the bishop. So a motion doesn't come into effect unless the bishop, or in this year's case, the administrator, gives assent. I mentioned earlier that questions is a part of the synod. The question actually is a formal part of the synod where people address a question to the president of the synod, a specific detailed written question, and there is a time, usually at the start of each day, where opportunity for questions is given. The question needs to be written down and handed to the synod secretaries. And the question is asked of the president. Sometimes the president asks other people to research and provide the answer for her, but it is asked of the president. And so the president gives all the best efforts to provide the answer during the synod. That is not always possible depending on the detail or the information required. If you do have a question and it is highly detailed or requires a fair amount of information, giving advance notice of the question through myself, the registrar, would be very, very helpful. That gives a chance for a proper research to be done, the right information to be brought forward, so that the answer, a complete answer, can be given in a timely way to the synod. The president otherwise may decide to give the answer sometime after the synod, and that may rob the questioner of the ability to have that information being given to the synod at that time. Petitions. This is written up in Part C of the standing orders, and there's, like questions, at least one opportunity per day to present petitions. Petitions are a way of seeking an action or a prohibition, but they're a very blunt instrument, and there's many alternatives in getting action or getting your issues aired before using a petition. A petition needs to be presented and goes on a synod record without the benefit of debate and the shared wisdom of synod. So it should really be treated as a last resort, and other avenues tried for discussion and getting an issue heard before that. So they're the materials that I've got there that cover the basic process of the synod. I hope that's proven helpful to you and that you'll find your synod experience more enlightening as a result. I hope that you'll be able to participate in synod and as years go on become more and more effective members of synod. Thank you.